Well, welcome to Breakpoint this week. It's a weekly conversation on what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview. I'm John Stonestreet, the president of the Colson Center, the host of Breakpoint. Pleased to be joined here, not by Shane Morris, my typical partner in crime, but Maria Baer, who's sat in before and is kind of becoming a common addition to Breakpoint this week. Welcome back, Maria.
Hi, John. Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Well, listen, everywhere I've gone, everyone that I've spoken to, every interview that I've been on the last week, it's kind of everyone has to begin the same way. Like we thought 2020 was over, and here we are in 2021. We spent a lot of time last week talking about what happened at the Capitol. Certainly heard from a lot of our listeners about that. We continue to talk about that. But the story continues. The story continues in that the House of Representatives has voted now to impeach Donald Trump for the second time. And as we head toward the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden, the United States, specifically Washington, D.C., is under a state of emergency. We have National Guard troops that have been deployed, not to another country around the world, not to a natural disaster, but because of the threat of domestic violence and rioting and so on in the nation's capital. And the FBI has reported that there's credible reports or credible information they have that suggests that violence is being planned or could be being planned in all 50 states at the State House to protest these election results. It's you kind of think, how can it get worse? How can it get worse? How can it get worse? And here we are as a nation.
My husband works downtown in the city that we live in, and he was contacted. He leases his office building, and the property owner contacted him today and let him know that the local police here is telling everybody downtown not to come downtown until at least next Wednesday. And all of the windows at our beautiful state house are all boarded up. I will say the same thing was done. Now, he wasn't told to stay away from downtown for safety reasons, but the state house was boarded up the week of the election as well. And we sort of were reflecting even that week, like, this is shameful. Like just that this expectation exists that people, and regardless of what side you're on the election, I don't think anybody knew who they were expecting to get violent, but it was like, we don't know. It could happen. Like that, our businesses and state houses are literally just boarding up their windows in anticipation of something like that. Is hard to get your mind around.
It is hard to get my mind around, and it's hard to see that this is kind of where we've come to. I've kind of put. Well, let me say it this way. Any worldview analysis of this situation requires that you kind of go to what we call preexisting conditions, that we go upstream from just what happened on last Wednesday at the Capitol. We go upstream even from this election. I think we even at some level have to go upstream even from the last 4 years, where an entire segment of the American population reached a level of engagement that they hadn't been for a long time. They saw in President Trump an answer to problems that they have long felt, being forgotten by the government, being forgotten by policy, and so on. Even beyond that, to the sort of culture that has produced a group of people in which two things are really spiking. One thing is what we often call deaths from despair, alcoholism, addictions, suicide rates. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns only exaggerated and escalated those concerns. And what I'm increasingly calling acts of desperation. We're a culture that is not giving people a sense of peace. We're a culture that's not giving people a sense of hope. And when that sense of hope that many people found in Donald Trump went away, then so did any sort of calm and reason. And here we are at a level of desperation. We're seeing a group of citizens. Now, at the same time, of course, we have desperate actors to other conditions earlier this year, and we also have desperate acts on an individual level, which we see. I would even, for example, include the disfiguring of one's own body and a perpetual search for identity as an act of desperation. But that's a personal one, and we're talking here about corporate ones. we got to say what's wrong is wrong, and at the same time, we're not going to come up with any sort of long-term solution without really an analysis of the problem that goes beyond the last week or even the last few months.
Sure. And I think what I'd add to that is, I think in addition to the desperation and the hopelessness, I wonder if there's an element too of just, I don't wonder, I know that there's an element of just pure rage.
Hmm.
And whether or not a person that's feeling that rage is self-aware enough to know that it blooms from hopelessness or despair is a question for a therapist, I guess. But it, the people at the Capitol, for example, and the people that were rioting in our cities over the summer, they don't. At least the people in the photos you're seeing and the video footage, it doesn't strike me as people like reluctantly going off to war because they feel that there's a sense of hope if they can just win this battle, or they can change the course of history in this way, then we can create a better society for our children or whatever. It doesn't feel that same way. It feels more like I'm so angry, and I seem to have stumbled on an object that I can direct that toward, and I'm going to move with that. I'm going to move on with that. Because in a lot of ways, so much of the anger that ends up being expressed is nonsensical or illogical.
Hmm.
In both cases, where you start to think this is more about the anger itself than it is about a certain cause. It reminds me of when I was in college, I used to work for a newspaper in my really small town in Ohio. The town was basically the university. And so I was one semester assigned to the student senate, and I had to go in to every student senate meeting every week and cover it. There was one student that came every week, and no matter what they were talking about, he would offer a comment and he was angry. And it literally, like, it got to the point where I looked forward to him coming because he made these meetings interesting. But I remember one week they were talking about where to put bike racks on campus, and he was mad. And it was like, I just remember thinking, I want to profile this guy or something because he's so mad, but he's not sure what he's mad about. He's just realized that he can focus it here. So he shows up week after week. And I've thought a lot about him lately. I don't know where he's at, but I see a lot of similarities there.
You do see a lot of similarities. I mean, I've kind of been thinking about this, and there was an interesting article this past week in The Atlantic about the estrangement between parents and kids. I've spent the last year, last year or more, actually, well, the last 2 years now, because last year didn't count because it was a skipped year. But I've spoken to a lot of grandparents. I'm about to speak at a
I was going to
wonderful
say,
event.
John, if you've been speaking to grandparents in the past year, you've been doing some iffy things. Like people are going to start tracking you if you say that on a podcast.
That's right. I have not been. I've done a lot of Zoom things, but even
Okay,
before
there you
that,
go.
in-person things through to grandparents. And I'm actually about to speak in an online event with our friends at the Legacy Coalition. And they do really great stuff helping people understand their role as grandparents. And just a number of them that come up and say, and this was even before COVID and before this, that the estrangement between generations has become so exaggerated, and that many grandparents say, I'm not allowed to see my grandkids, or I'm allowed to as long as I don't talk about A, B, and C. And usually that has something to do with either sexuality, technology, or Trump. Like those are the off limits things. And increasingly COVID has made that even worse, and this election specifically has made that even worse. And you talk about this guy that's always angry, and I'm seeing more and more of those, that all of these issues, a disagreement on this is not just a disagreement, even fellow believers. And I've been really clear on kind of what I think happened in the election and where I think we are and who the players are. And um, I see little truth in some things that some people hold, but the response is not I think you're wrong and here's why, or I disagree with you and I hope you'll consider elsewhere. It's like, you need to repent, you sinner, for not believing this particular theory that I found on the nether regions of the internet. And I get that. I feel, but part of that is that people feel like so much is at stake. So much weight has been put uh, because so many other parts of culture that carried so much of our weight, family, the home, the church, these things carried a lot of weight, culturally speaking. and these things have become thin. And so all the weight has been on the political process, and then gets dumped even further on this election, or this controversy, or this hearing, or this scandal in DC. So much, rest on that, and it just riles us, to the core. But on the flip side, as believers, I'm just stunned. And it's happened in my own family. It's happened in my own circle of friends. It's happened across the board, where the anger and suddenly the complete questioning of another person's faith, another person's sanity, another person's, well-meaning, has just gone out the window.
Mhm.
Uh, and man, that sort of stuff is really hard to recover from personally, the hurt feelings. And then of course, once you take it on social media, then it takes on a life of its own.
Sure. And I think this is part of a larger pre-existing condition, as you would say, which is that it's become trendy now. In I think younger generations, but that of course has ripple effects to the older generations, like the grandparents you're talking to. It's trendy now to look at your life in terms of curating your community. So we throw around the word toxic a lot, and this the gentleman who wrote that story in the Atlantic, I read that too, and he mentioned this word. He's a psychologist. He said he's heard a lot of it, where we've started to use that word in where it used to be reserved maybe for people who, let's say, like an abusive spouse or an abusive parent. Now we use it to say like, well, my sister, called me out on a sin of mine, and it made me feel bad, so I consider her toxic now. So I'm going to carve her out of my life. And once you use that word, it's like it's a signal switches, and everyone around you has to say, you're so brave for doing that. Like it's our responsibility to curate this community where we're only surrounded by people that make us feel good, that don't scare us, that never make us uncomfortable. And I think what this psychologist was writing about in the Atlantic is now we're now extending that philosophy to families. So even if people in our families, like my parents weren't perfect and did some things that I didn't like, well, now I can use the word toxic, and not only is it good for me to just cut them off from mine and my kids' lives, but I'm brave now and I'm courageous. And this was, a good thing to do. Which of course then just completely does away with any self-awareness of the fact that I've probably done some things to let down the people in my family as well and my friends. God forbid if everyone in my life, every time I made an error, was like, you're a toxic person now with a capital T and I can't be around you. And I think that has already happened, especially with social media, like you said, among friends, among churches, among church families. And we're just extending it now, unfortunately, to our blood families. And yeah, I think the ripples of that are going to be devastating.
Well, the verdict's still out of whether you're a toxic co-host, and if you are, then we won't have you back. You're
Oh
listening to
no.
Breakpoint this week. You're listening to Breakpoint this week. I'm John Stonestreet, here along with Maria Baer. We're talking about the issues of the week from a Christian worldview. Stay with us. We'll be right back. We're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here, along with Maria Baer, sitting in again this week for Shane Morris, who will be back with us shortly. One of the things that we haven't had a chance to talk about, and it's amazing when you kind of add all these stories up, they've been so fast and furious. And of course, one has led to another, led to another, led to another. But one of the things that came out of the protest, that the demonstration that became protests, that became riots, that became violent at the Capitol last Wednesday, was Twitter kicked the president off permanently, forever. Other social media platforms followed suit. Other powerful corporate interests, such as Amazon Web Services, basically made it impossible for an alternative social media site like Parler to even continue. And so now they're officially, out of business. And there are others that are trying to catch on, but nowhere near with the power of kind of big tech and big information. Along those lines, there was a video that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez released this past week, and she does Twitter videos for her followers, in which she suggested that a topic of conversation around Democratic House members had been a commission on speech and what speech needed to be controlled for the public good. A certain suggestion, which obviously anyone who's read any of the dystopian novels ever written in history ever, the hair would have stood up on the back of our necks, and it did. I have similar concerns even about the impeachment hearings this week, that um, the impeachment of the president and the particular charge of inciting violence. And I think, and I've said this publicly, how he behaved that Wednesday was a dereliction of duty, and probably that sort of thing could have been elevated as impeachment level charges.
Mhm.
But to say that a tweet or even the speech that he gave prior, and that those words were violent words, the concern that I have is that we know what has happened on college campuses. We know what's happened in the media. We know what, particular victims often call hateful speech includes anyone who disagrees with me. And will that now become part of the political discourse to the degree, not just of castigating a fellow lawmaker, but actually leading to impeachment? Listen, this is the sort of thought control. Now, at one level, you might say this is the necessary reaction to the sort of thing that we saw, and that this is going to come out of that, and we better, own up to it. I think there's things we absolutely people are going to need to own up to, Christians included, conservatives included. But that's a very stunning state of affairs to see that sort of level on information control when particular information providers hold so much power over thought, over the market, over international relations, over the public imagination.
That's the question is, where is the intersection of how much control they have and their right as a private company? Because if they were smaller, let's talk about Twitter. If they were smaller, and they banned somebody, I mean, I think most people would say, at least especially most conservatives would say, yeah, I mean, they have the right to do whatever they want with their thing that they created and that they run. But the issue is, we wrote a breakpoint about this, like maybe last summer, but we were talking specifically about Google, and how much control they have, not just over what people say, but what information people can actually access. And on the one hand, again, your spidey sense goes up in terms of it's their company and they should have certain rights that go with business ownership. But on the other hand, they are now, whether we like it or not, or whether we consented to this, I guess, or not, they are the public square now for a lot of intents and purposes. So Google and things like Twitter and Facebook, they are the public square. So Twitter, I saw that Jack did a tweet thread either today or yesterday. Jack is the CEO of Twitter, and he said something like, if we ban a person like the president, they're welcome to go somewhere else. Well, there's not another Twitter, and I haven't figured this out. I don't mean to talk about this like I know the answer, but you have to wrestle with the fact that they are the de facto public square, and um, they are also facing the possibility of like litigation. If somebody, that's another, we're a super litigious country, and that's another thing that a lot of these companies have to, and I'm sure are thinking about, that they don't want to get sued by someone who says, this person used your platform to organize some sort of violence. So I don't know what the answer is, but you can't simply say, well, we're a private company, we can do whatever we want, when you're that big, and you have that much influence. And again, the issue, like, AOC would obviously have an issue if she heard a Republican or somebody she disagrees with saying, we need to set up a commission. The issue isn't, should speech be controlled? The issue is, if it should, who controls it? And how do we decide that person? And that there's never a good answer to that question. It just doesn't work in a republic.
Yeah, I mean, we're so far down the rabbit hole in this; it's kind of hard to see the surface, right? I mean, what
Mhm.
does it look like to backpedal from a place where the internet and specifically social media providers don't hold an inordinate amount of power in the American public square? I mean, I don't know that we can ever see anything in all of history that rivals, for example, the sort of power that the big ones, Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, Apple, what they have in so many different ways. And of course, the government has seen places where private companies have monopolized particular arenas, and have seen fit that doesn't serve the
Right.
public good, and then it limits public access or equal access and so on. But we've never seen anything like this. And I struggle too, as a free market guy, as a private guy, as I think guys saying, keep the government out of this, and realizing, look, the most powerful force on the planet right now isn't the government. The most powerful force in our society isn't the government. It is the political process, but maybe the most powerful force in politics isn't state actors and government officials. It's this medium. And we're so far down the line on this where we've uncritically embraced, and this is part of the long history of evangelicalism. It's one of the most interesting parts of the history of evangelicalism. Whereas as new technologies of communication and reaching more and more people, gospel-driven folks have jumped on these platforms. And I'm going back to newspapers, right? Many people don't realize that one of the innovations of the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening, was the use of newspapers. For the first time, you could communicate to mass numbers of people about these conversions. And that's what they did. I mean, it's like kind of like the obituaries. Instead of dying, though, here are all the people that were born again. And it was reported to the colonies, and it sparked all this excitement. It's a great moment in history. Or obviously the radio, television during the 80s, with the Falwells and the Jim Bakkers and so on. And of course, we saw this not only in the United States, we saw it in the opening up of the Soviet Union, the mass media that was allowed to replace the propaganda. And it's really a remarkable thing. And the challenge is that kind of classic line from Marshall McLuhan, that the medium is the message. And social media is a different medium, not only in limited characters, not only because of you have an algorithm that determines who sees what and why sees who and all that, but you also, just the scale of it. We haven't seen anything that has been that invasive in day-to-day life, and our habits, aren't great. Now, I have wondered if this is one of the things that the Lord is preparing us for. I was speaking last weekend, and somebody didn't fully agree with some of the analysis that I was giving, and the response was,
No
again,
way.
out of that. I know it's hard to believe.
Can't believe that.
When we all get to heaven,
You're
what a
so
day of
lukewarm
rejoicing that
and
will be.
wishy-washy. I can't believe somebody would.
Well, the response was, if we don't stand up now, we'll lose everything. And my thought on that is, Christians have been called to stand up for what's true and what's good. But there are many cases through history where Christians have stood up and they've never lost everything because they've never lost Christ. But they have lost, this particular cause or this particular thing they were fighting for. Think of many of the characters in the Bible. And I wonder if this is what the Lord has for us. I'm not wishing this on anyone, certainly. But it may be, people are like, how do we, come up with another social media platform that outdoes all of these others? It may not be possible. But what it might be is that you and I need to figure out how to talk to our neighbors, in person rather than anonymously to the masses. Because a lot changes when you look your neighbor in the eye and listen and talk and share the truth with them and have that conversation than, being anonymous.
Yeah. I think I've heard a lot of that too. What if we lose everything? And I think you hit it on the head. My gut reaction to that is you cannot, if you are a believer in Jesus, you cannot lose everything. And if you think you can, you need to reevaluate what you think everything is. I think of the worst possible outcome you can imagine. And there are some really bad ones. We could lose our republic. Abortion could flourish. Like the terrible, horrible pain, suffering, the wrath of God, right? It's still not the worst thing. That's still not the worst thing. And the worst thing is losing our relationship with Jesus. And we know that we can never lose that. So I think that's very powerful to remember and to remind ourselves of. At the same time, like you said, I was about to give my plug during this conversation for just get off social media, just get off of it. And part of me still thinks that is wise from just a user standpoint. Like I've just noticed in my own life, I was one of the first college classes to get Facebook. Our university actually forced us to get it. They wanted it to be like, we're going to disseminate university information over here. So it was the year after Mark Zuckerberg had created it. And not every college had it, but it came to mine and they made us all get it. So I've had it for a long time, but I've just noticed in the past several years, it's just become a net negative in my life, and I think in a lot of people's lives. And so I've just become this spokesperson for getting off of it. At the same time, though, I recognize what you're saying, where the very last thing we want in a time when this kind of technology is so powerful is all the Christians to just run away from it, just
Mm.
abandon it. Like maybe the answer is get off it yourself, but then like go get on the board of directors or something like that, like that kind of thing. I don't know, but it's hard to thread. It's going to be a part of our lives, whether or not we're personally on it or not. So we're going to have to figure out how to coexist with it in a useful way. And like you said, I think a lot of Christians are doing that.
Yeah.
Um,
You kind of wonder, there was a renovation in the theology of work about 25 years ago in the church across America, and it led to some really wonderful reclamations of some Reformation
mhm,
teachings about calling and vocation and the good of the spheres of our involvement outside of church life, or the sacredness of a calling to other areas other than being a pastor. And you look back through history, and this is one of the things that you have to realize is that for a lot of cultural moments and a lot of times in a lot of places, everybody else was forced to play on the church's turf, right? Because the
right.
church led by building these platforms and institutions of education, and
Mhm,
it was a blessing to the world. Or think about hospitals, or think about, just kind of even the whole drive of the sciences and what the sciences was all about until, the Enlightenment, and especially the 19th century changed some of that. And so we're kind of experiencing today the opposite, where
right.
Christians saw the good of creativity, the good of innovation, the good of entrepreneurship, every walk, every square inch, as we would say, belonging to Christ. And the cultural context in which that created. Now, not to say that these platforms or institutions or programs or areas themselves were flawless, but you know what? If you were going to study music for hundreds and hundreds of years in Western history, you were going to study an awful lot about, the birth of Jesus and the Annunciation and the resurrection, and because that was the platform that was built. It was the innovation. And the fact of the matter is, as many people have noted, the West has become more and more secularized, which means that religion has been taken out of all these areas and pushed more and more into a privatized area of heart so that they don't apply out there. And then
Mhm,
also, honestly, the church hasn't cultivated this rich sense of calling in the next generation. And
mhm,
so, you kind of think, well, if I'm going to be I think John Stott said this, if, we've told young people, if they're really going to be a Christian, they'll be a missionary. If they're not quite that spiritual, they'll be a pastor. If they're not quite that spiritual, they'll be a teacher. And if they're really backslidden, they'll go into politics or Hollywood, you know, and well, at some level, we've reaped what that sort of teaching has sowed, right? That
yeah.
now, when it comes to technology and the sciences, even when it comes to largely the arts, now we find ourselves playing on a field that we don't recognize, or that in many cases might even be hostile to the faith. So there's some long-term lessons here that I don't want to miss, and I want to say all that knowing that uh, there are wonderful people who follow the Lord who are really disillusioned and really disheartened right now. And I think maybe the best thing we can say is, as Chuck Colson would say, is despair is a sin and Christ is risen from the
Mm,
dead.
amen. Yeah. I think that's so good.
You're listening to Breakpoint this week. I'm John Stonestreet, here along with Maria Baer. We're talking about the issues of the week from a Christian worldview. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Well, here in the extended version that you only get on the podcast, you don't get on the radio. I want to bring up one other story. We're going to be talking a lot about this, Maria, on Breakpoint at the Colson Center in the days to come. We always point this out because one of the most important things for Christians to remember is that we are part of a great cloud of witnesses. Now, we know that that transcends cultures, it transcends years and time places, but also transcends time and place here and now. And every year, Open Doors, the organization Open Doors, releases what's called the World Watch List, in which they highlight countries in which religious persecution that's specifically designated at Christians is increasing. This is not a list you want to make. You want to get off the list. And they list out, a top 10, top 20 of these nations. China, there's some really interesting storylines here, and we'll link to the whole report if you come to breakpoint.org. But I said this midway through the pandemic as we were looking at so many other things, that we have to remember what's happening around the world, because you know what the worst year on record was for Christian persecution? It was 2019. And the year before that was 2018 and 2017. In other words, we're on a long-term trajectory. And the question was, what were the lockdowns going to do to this? Is, what were the financial stresses that particular countries were facing? What was that going to do to their ability to marginalize or persecute Christians? And, look, and listen to this: in Nigeria alone, 10 Christians a day are murdered on average. 1 in 6 Christians in all of Africa endure faith-based discrimination and violence. The scale of this has reached new highs or lows.
It's really unbelievable and horrifying. It feels like there's two different worlds. There's the one I live in, and then there's the world that our brothers and sisters are living in. And it's hard to imagine. We think about, at least I think about my faith here in the United States a lot in terms of when I'm feeling negative about it, I should say. Like, what do I miss out on because of this? Like, there's social stigma, there's probably professional opportunities. Like, man, this is challenging. And, as I pass this on to my kids, how difficult will their life be because of this? I've never once thought, man, I don't know if I go out to the grocery store today, if I'll make it back home. But the reality is that there are way too many of our brothers and sisters that are under that threat right now, and it's purely for being Christians. And yeah, it's just hard to read. It's really scary.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think I just misstated this earlier, but this list, the World Watch list published by Open Doors, lists the top 50 countries where it's most dangerous to be Christian. I want to point out just a couple of highlights. I already said 1 in 6 Christians in Africa face faith-based discrimination and violence. That also, in terms of the scale of Christians around the world who are under the threat of discrimination, violence, or even persecution, 340 million Christians worldwide, 1 in 8 Christians. So 1 out of 8. I mean, for some homeschool families, that would be within the family. It's just
Homeschool.
really, I mean, we're just talking about a really kind of front and center scale here. Couple highlights. I say highlights. That's the wrong word here, but a couple of the more surprising things. China, of course, is often, the one that's kind of top on people's minds,
Mhm.
but they have not been in the top 20 for over a decade. They re-entered the top 20.
Yeah.
A lot of that has to do with the crackdown on the demonstrators in Hong Kong, the crackdown on house churches. But you also had we also are seeing that where basically the Chinese are trying to just rid their country in particular of any sort of Muslim and when it comes to the Muslim Uyghurs, any sort of loyalty to anything other than the state. And that points out that once again, in the top 20, with one notable exception that I can see, you're talking about the persecution of Christians is coming from secular state actors like North Korea, China, right?
Mhm.
That are doing in the name of atheism, or some version of an atheistic worldview. The others are Muslim. So again, we have a clash of worldviews, secularism and Islam, that in certain conditions in these cultural settings are targeting Christians.
Right. Yeah. And they talked about in Yemen, which is a largely Islamic country, if you leave the Muslim faith, you could face the death penalty for that. So whether you convert to Christianity or you just denounce the Muslim faith, you could face the death penalty for that. So that's religious violence, obviously there. And I also, they pointed out in this report, like you said, this is probably going to be one of the worst years on record as well. And the coronavirus, the pandemic really worsened this, because what it did, unfortunately, is it gave a lot of these governments leverage over their citizens that they didn't have before it. So aid, especially foreign aid, goes through governments to get to the people. So now suddenly they can withhold aid from folks that profess to be Christians. And there are records of that happening in some of these countries. So the pandemic there's so many terrible ripple effects from it. And this is just another one of them.
Yeah, we mentioned China earlier, and in a point commentary that'll be coming out here in the next couple days, we tell the story of one of those examples in which COVID allowed state actors to make things worse. And in this case, the state actors, at least what it seems, appeared on social media and blamed Christians for outbreaks over the holiday in a particular province in China. The only thing is, there weren't any Christian gatherings or Christian activities because of government restrictions. But before the correct truth, the whole truth was able to be told, that social media narrative had already spread. And it very much brought to mind, as I say in the point commentary, and I'm thankful for our colleague Roberta Rivera for bringing this up. Tertullian said, whenever you hear about a calamity, wherever you hear about a disaster, it'll be quickly followed by, and feed Christians to the lions, right? And we know about Nero blaming Christians for the burning of Rome and so on.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of what you see. I mean, I hate to, to use the quote, but in these sorts of situations, these governments, these bad actors are not letting a crisis go to waste. And that's what we're seeing. Nigeria, I'm going to highlight that. Nigeria is at number 9. Nigeria is an incredibly big country. It's got an enormous population. It's in the top 5 of all countries in the entire world. So you do that math, and we know China's up there and they're in the top 20. Nigeria is in the top 5. I think it's the 5th or the 4th most populated country, and it's number 9 on this list. And we have spent a lot of time this past year working with our friends at ICON, the international conference on Nigeria. I have been part of a number of events with NFL star Benjamin Watson, Frank Wolf, the former congressman, as well as a Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who has been actually outspoken in defense of the persecuted Christians in Nigeria. Not as a Christian herself, but she has been. Yeah. Another interesting one, and I say interesting in the most tragic sort of way, because of their interesting, I don't want to say even interesting, but their relationship with President Trump and the United States growing. I mean, when you look at this list, a lot of these are just kind of like, domestic enemies number 1, North Korea,
right.
Afghanistan, Somalia.
Places that have been disasters for a long time.
For a long time. And then you have India. India. And India is the exception. In that they our international relations with India tend to be pretty strong, and they're not state secularist, and they're not Muslim. We're talking about militant Hindus, including the prime minister that's part of a militant Hindu party, and that is just a devastating situation right now. We did a story on this just right before the new year, talking about, again, false accusations of sharing your faith in a region where if you share your faith, you're, it's against the law. That was three Christians. They weren't sharing their faith. They were just feeding the hungry because of the COVID situation. They were accused of sharing their faith. There was flimsy evidence that they were, but that they were just trying to feed the hungry, like Christians have done throughout history, and it did not spare them from, from the law. So this is another place where Christians are facing just incredible difficulty, and it's the outlier on the list.
And what's remarkable about India as well is it's obviously it's one of the most populous countries in the world and very advanced technologically in a lot of regions. But it's also so I'm looking at this data from an organization called Joshua Project, which looks at, the spread of the gospel across the world. And India is one of the top 10 largest unreached people groups for the gospel. So that means it's in the group of top 10 of the number of people that not only aren't believers, but have literally never heard the gospel live in India right now, which is, again, it's more shocking than if it were a country that was further behind India in terms of infrastructure and technology. But to be, so advanced in those areas and to have so many people that haven't even heard the gospel is remarkable. And the only way that's possible, I think, is through the kind of oppression that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's a great point. One of our Colson fellows, and actually my first childhood best friend, has an organization, a Christian humanitarian organization and does some remarkable work in India. And he's
Mm,
testified to the sort of thing that we are
mhm.
just talking about here. It's anyway, I think there's probably a lot more punchlines to come out, but if you come to breakpoint.org, click on the link for this program. We'll put in the show notes a link to the Open Doors USA World Watch List for 2021. It's a list of the top 50 countries where it is most dangerous to be Christian. And if nothing else, pray. And I say if nothing else, as if that's nothing else. I mean, praying is exactly what we're supposed to do. And our brothers and sisters around the world, as we have come to know, pray for us. And we need to pray for them as well. Well, it's that time of the program here, Maria, as we wrap up the extended podcast version to give our recommendations. This can be anything that has meant a lot, you've enjoyed, something that's challenged your thinking. It can be something you read, something you watched. What do you got for us this week?
Okay, so I'm going to recommend a new book just came out. There's an author named Tana French. She is, I think, American born, but she's lived in Ireland for decades. And all of her novels are mystery novels that take place in Ireland. Usually it's about the police force and how they investigate crimes. But what is so brilliant about her writing is that the stories are all mostly about the characters involved. The plot is important, but it's not the biggest element. And she is like, she has to be psychologically trained or something like that, because the way she creates people that are super nuanced and complex is really, really fun to read. And because of that, I never know what's going to happen because people are unpredictable and that's real life. So the latest one that just came out, this is her, I think, sixth one, and it's called The Searcher. And I'm halfway through it, and it's really spooky so far and really good. So I recommend that. Read fiction. It's a lot of fun.
Read fiction. So is your recommendation to
Mhm.
read fiction or read this particular bit of fiction?
Read fiction and start with this one.
All
Two
right.
for one.
Well, speaking of reading fiction, and this, I don't know if this falls into the category of pure fiction, but I was just reminded of how profound it is on so many levels, and that is C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, which I'm sure has already gotten a
Oof.
shout out this week. But I want to read to everyone something. And I say this is my recommendation, but I'm completely just stealing this from my wife who, as we were, reading together the other night, she pulled this out and she said, "This is just another line from Screwtape Letters." And Screwtape Letters is one of those books that it's so contemporarily relevant that every time you read it, you'll pull out another quote and say, "This is talking about today." And this
Mhm.
was one that I had not heard or I'd not remembered even from when I've read it. And it made me just basically think that I need to put this kind of as an annual read rather than a every 4 or 5 year read.
Mm.
But of course, Screwtape Letters is about an experienced devil talking to a nephew, novice devil, of how to kind of sideswipe the enemy. And the enemy, of course, being this Christian and or the client, I guess. And here's what he said, the uncle: "Do what you will, there is going to be some benevolence as well as some malice in your patient soul." Yeah, patient, that's the word I was looking for. "The great thing is to listen to this. This is fascinating. Direct the malice to his immediate neighbors, whom he meets every day, and to thrust his benevolence out to the remote circumference to people he does not know. The malice thus becomes wholly real and the benevolence largely imaginary." And I thought, wow, if there is an illustration of what social
Mm.
media does to us, right? Except social media does give us the illusion that we're kind of sending our malice out to the great unknown. But then anyone who's been defriended and deplatformed and
Mm.
lost family members, and relationships over this knows that it's a very specific sort of malice.
Yep.
But how
And it's
common is it?
the
Go ahead.
laziest way to do it. It's the
A
laziest
laziest
way
way
to
to do it.
love people and the laziest way to hate people.
Yeah, and on the other hand, how common is it today, particularly in a progressive version of charity, uh, to love the common man, which means you never have to love any
Mm.
particular one,
Mhm.
to
Oof,
love a
so
group
good.
so that you never actually have to care for that one. And I just thought, man, there's something about Lewis that I love, and it just reminded me of that. And so, even though I'm not currently reading it again, it's on the short list to go back and read again. And this is a shout out to my wife. I'll say the Screwtape Letters as my recommendation for the week.
I was just thinking about the screw tape letters the other day because there is a church. There's a lot of beautiful, really, really old churches. Our city was founded and, around the pilgrims. I mean, not far long after. And there's some really beautiful old buildings. There's an old church downtown that has a sign up right now with a rainbow flag. And the sign says, historic building, modern thinking.
Hmm.
And there's another letter in the screw tape letters where the uncle says, what you want to do is get your patient to worry not about what's right and good, but about uh, phrases like where the flow of history is going. You want to make him worry about being relevant and modern, more so than being right or thoughtful. And it was just like, yeah, that's what would make you put up a sign that says historic building, modern thinking.
Hmm.
Also, I want to add to your recommendation to read Screw Tape Letters. Get to know Sarah Stonestreet because she's so awesome. So listen to Strong Women because
Yeah, the
I love
Strong Women
Sarah.
podcast. I've recommended that so many times already that I can't actually do it anymore without, crossing some sort of, ethical line of, conflict of
I'll
interest.
do
But
it. I'll do it
you
for
did
you.
it. You did it. No,
Yeah.
that's good. We'll link to that too if you come to breakpoint.org. Well, thanks for joining us on today's podcast. Maria, if people want to find you, where will they find you?
MariaEBaer.com. That is MariaEBaer.com.
And you write for also Christianity Today and World Magazine, and you had
World
a terrific
Magazine.
piece that I want people to read. We'll link to it about how Bibles have survived calamity and tragedy. It was a fascinating article that was in CT just before Christmas. Really fascinating. So we'll link to that if you come to breakpoint.org. Great to have you sitting in again for Shane Morse. We'll have you back again. You have not become a toxic co-host.
Oh, I'm so glad. Okay. Yeah, because once somebody accuses you of that, there's no coming back from it.
Toxic is like
you're just toxic, man.
It is
That's
the
a
scarlet
mic drop.
letter. That's the scarlet letter. You
It's
cannot come
true.
back from that. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Join us again next
Thanks,
time
John.
for Breakpoint This Week in the Breakpoint Podcast.